definitely names that I hadn't, met before. So really excited to. Awesome. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. Really excited to meet you all and give you an overview of this new book that I'm so excited to share with you. Super excited to see some of the folks in the chat. Looks like Siobhan and Aaron and others are here. Really grateful for y'all listening. But I actually saw the list of folks that had registered. It's a lot of new faces. So really looking forward to having this opportunity to share with you all, a little bit of the backstory behind how this book came to be, and really, take an hour out of our busy lives and our busy days to get out of our current reality and really reorient towards the future here. So I'm going to wait just a couple more seconds here until everybody joins, and then we'll get started here. And then Spekit team, can you just let me know where I can see the attendee list in the list? That would be great as well. Awesome. Now, if you've ever seen me present, I really like having these sessions be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to jump in and ask them. Seeing a few familiar faces here. For those of you that were at SEC New York, this presentation is going to sound very familiar since it's very similar to the one that I gave there. It's really for everyone who wasn't able to be there. So hopefully this serves as great reinforcement now that you've had the book. Now, for anyone who's joining now, if you've had the book, if you've received the book, if you've ordered it, feel free to put it in the chat. Would love to hear if you've had a chance to read it, if anything stood out yet as we kind of go through this. So let's dive in. My name is Melanie Fellay. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Spekit. And before I jump into giving you an overview of this book, I do want to make sure that you know where to grab a copy. For those of you that signed up that don't have one, you can go to justintimeenablement.com. We just ran out of the first batch, but we have a new order coming in here, hopefully in the next week, that we'll be sending out. So please feel free to, thank you, Benedict. Appreciate the testimonial there. But if you haven't grabbed one yet, feel free to sign up and we'll get one to you, hopefully in the next 2 weeks, depending on print time. So with that, if you're coming to SEC Denver, we do have a few parts aside there. And I did want to remind all of you that have the book, there is a fun contest running here. If you go on LinkedIn, you'll see that you have a chance to win $1,000 between now and April 1st. So it's really rewarding those that got the book first, the first 600 copies. And so if you've ordered the book and you want to post on LinkedIn, this is a great way to enter this contest. But anyway, thank you all for everyone. I see Siobhan just entered the chat. She was an early beta reader. I'm so grateful to everyone in the enablement community, everyone in the revenue community that really helped me shape my thoughts and ultimately the final outcome. So with that, I want to give a little bit of context. When did she write a book? Why did I write a book? Especially since there's a lot of faces here that I don't recognize on the call. And so just as a little bit of background, I posted this on LinkedIn, but this book wasn't part of my plan for last year. For those of you that have followed along the journey, I started the company 8 years ago. Every year I try and find 1 or 2 days where I kind of go on a solo trip. I try and go to the mountains, sometimes on a road trip, but really just a space to kind of get out of my day-to-day, get out of my reality, get out of like the noise and the problems, and really just kind of like take a true assessment of, what's working in the business, what changes are happening in the world, in the marketplace that I should be paying more attention to. And I always find immense moments of clarity. And so last summer I did that in the month of June. And I went up to Idaho Springs in Colorado. I always find the mountains really grounding. And there, I really just kind of started writing. I journal a lot. And I started writing. And before I knew it, I was really just writing my thoughts on the future. And I went back, and something I like to do is actually go back and revisit old decks. So going back to the first fundraising deck that I pitched back in 2018, going back to the second fundraising deck that we pitched back in 2020, and kind of going back and seeing, which of these assumptions about the future were true and what has changed. The enablement landscape has changed, revenue, AI, we're going to talk about all that change, but there's a lot happening. And so, really my goal was to take a moment. And before I knew it, after compiling a lot of things, I had 56 pages of content, and I was like, what do I do with this? And long story short, I shared it with a few folks, a few friendlies early on. And, I was like, hey, is this interesting? It feels like we need to have more of the community, really speaking to these things and talking about these subjects. And that's really what eventually led to the book over the holidays. So I hope you enjoy it. But, even though I wrote this book this year, really, if I pull up this slide, right, where we talk about the future of enablement, right, where you can access key sales enablement in every customer interaction, you can increase productivity with resource-setting tips, you can drive adoption, reinforce process training. This is a slide from our Series A pitch deck, actually from our seed pitch deck. So this is a slide from 2018. And, you'll see the logos. Some of those are actually the old versions of logos. But, I think it just really brings home that, this vision for the future, while it might seem distant, it might feel like when you have these dreams and you don't know what's going to be possible, it feels so far. But then when you see that journey of, hey, would it be possible to create this unified layer of knowledge? You'll see our old logo again. This is from our Series A, where I was really painting this vision of, what would it look like if you could have this layer of enablement of knowledge that connected to your tech stack, that would pull insights, recommend in real time, and measure progress and impact, right? This has really been a vision that I've been excited about for 8 years. So while the book talks a lot about the future, it's a topic that I've been thinking about literally nonstop for 8 years. And then last one here, just a little bit of fun. This was from our Series B deck, called it My Spekit, but it's really this vision for a personalized coach. But let's kind of ground into, what does the future look like? So at the end of the day, why I think this is such an important time to be talking about the future is that things have radically changed in our environment, right? With every single person that I speak to, whether they're on the front lines, right? Sellers or CSMs that are trying to absorb all the change happening in their products and services, whether it's the enablement teams that are trying to keep track of all the innovation that their product teams are rolling out that they need to enable their teams on, trying to keep track of all the competitors and everything changing. Things are happening at an unprecedented rate, and it's only going to keep getting faster, right? With artificial intelligence, with technological advancement, everything is getting faster and faster by the minute. And so I think we're at a really interesting juncture in time right now where companies are really stepping back for what feels like the first time since really, I'd say, 2015 is what felt like the last time there was this big of a resurgence of like, hey, we really need to adopt SaaS. We need to move to the cloud. It feels like companies are really, leadership teams are assessing like, what does the future of our team look like, right? What are the roles that we're going to need? How many sellers are we going to need? How do we drive more efficiency? What does AI actually look like for not only our business, but for our industry? What are the, flashy bells and whistle use cases, but really how do we transform and where do we go? Because at the end of the day, change is happening at a faster rate than ever before, right? What used to be quarterly releases of your products and services that moved to monthly and weekly now are happening daily, right? I see so often CEOs, and frankly, I look at our own change log, but technology CEOs that are, proud of having announced, 1,000 releases or 100 releases of new features in the last year, which is incredible because it speaks to, how much artificial intelligence is accelerating the development progress. We've seen that, even in our own teams, in terms of being able to improve, how you review code with artificial intelligence and even generating code, like the piece is only going to keep getting faster. So we're living in an era where change is going to keep happening faster, not just within your own business, but in your industry, in your buyers, and how they operate. And so the question is, how do we handle all this change? How do we get new hires up to speed on a much larger set of products and services and information they need to know? How do we keep our existing team really able to deliver when things are changing constantly all around them? And so this is the question ultimately that every leader is asking themselves. And, PwC just did their annual state of, they call it their annual CEO survey. They survey thousands of CEOs across a multitude of industries. There's tons of really interesting data in it. But this year they found, and actually I just looked at the stat that was last year's, this year just came out, it's 42% of CEOs think that if they don't radically transform their business, they are simply going to basically go extinct. And so CEOs of companies are asking themselves in board meetings with their executive teams, like, what do we need to do to really embrace the future in front of us? And Salesforce just did a study, and 78% of sales leaders are concerned that their companies are missing out on AI, that they're not moving fast enough on the opportunity, both in terms of how to internally enable and how to externally enable. And as you'll see in the book, this is something that I really press on, right? Each chapter has these different pro tips in it because I really want to make it as actionable and tactical as possible, right? My goal is, yes, let's help you envision a future and what that looks like in terms of what technology can do, but also like what are steps you can take literally today to help bring your team along. And so some of those tips are, how can you run trainings for your teams to enable them on AI, right? How can you build prompt libraries? How can you, in your role, really learn the different, use cases for AI and how it can accelerate your own role? And so there's a lot of tips in the book. I won't go through all of them, obviously, here in this presentation, but I highly recommend that you take a look at those. But at the end of the day, like, everyone's thinking about this pressing question, which is like, what does the future look like for us? And ultimately, I believe that speed is the advantage, right? Because at the end of the day, competition is getting tougher than it ever has before. And the majority of sales reps just don't expect to meet quota. And so in an environment where your sellers don't feel confident they can hit quota, competition is getting, heated up. Speed at which you're going to be able to help your reps ultimately feel ready, feel equipped to be able to get on every call and feel confident is more essential than ever. And as this rate of change continues to increase, so does the criticality of enablement, right? As change gets faster, the criticality of enablement is going up and up and up and up. But the effectiveness of yesterday's playbooks is no longer working. And you're actually seeing those breaking points more and more, where your content, it's becoming harder and harder to keep your content up to date. It's becoming harder and harder to ensure that your processes scale with all the changes. And that alone is a huge pain point. And so ultimately, I believe that speed is the advantage. And we're seeing that some companies, right, like ZoomInfo, they recently leveraged just-in-time enablement to drive a really important change in how they were prospecting. And that made a huge difference in making sure that their teams were actually properly dispositioning their opportunities so that they could get entered into the right kind of process. And they were able to recover a ton of pipeline that had previously simply fallen through the cracks because their reps weren't following the right process. Similarly, Equifax, it's an organization that's been around since 1899. I looked up the date right before my SEC presentation. So you're talking about an organization that's been around for 126 years. And they were able to reduce their ramp up time as well as their average handling time. So how fast in their case, call center reps are able to answer questions by enabling their reps just in time. And so we really believe that the speed at which your teams are able to execute is really important. And ultimately, these organizations, these teams have really embraced the future of enablement. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what the book is about. And I'm not going to talk too much through it right now, but I'm going to talk through it here in a few in terms of really the core pillars that I believe make for the future of a really compelling enablement environment. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges. So we just partnered with the SEC. Everyone that's on this webinar will get one of the first copies. We're going to be launching the official report, I believe, in the next 2 weeks, last time I checked. But we just did a survey that we called the Impact of Enablement Report, and we excluded our customers from it because I didn't want any bias in the results. But what I really wanted to understand is, if you look at the current state of enablement, right, both for companies that use a platform, right, an existing enablement platform, of which there are many that are great brands and have really pioneered the industry, as well as companies that don't, right, that kind of rely on like a Google Drive or maybe a Notion or Confluence, right, that I would say are more traditional platforms. But 55% of respondents cited that there was low adoption by reps as a key reason for switching platforms. So one of the number one reasons why companies switch from one enablement platform to the next is because of low adoption by reps, right? And when you actually looked at the rate of content adoption, right, so much time is spent by enablement teams and marketing teams creating this amazing content for this new product launching, for this new, package, you name it. And yet 92%, over 90% of teams believe that less than 60% of their content is actually getting used. And so when you think about how much time is being spent creating content, and then you realize that hardly any of your content is actually being used, like if you look here, you'll see that about 40% of respondents thought that only between 20 and 40% of their content is being used. And 25% of you, 1 out of every 4 teams, believes that less than 20% of their content is being used. And so you're at this interesting crossroads because you're spending more and more time creating content. And yes, AI has made that a lot easier, thank God. And we'll talk a lot more about that. But at the same time, your reps aren't using it. And so it seems like we've kind of just accepted that as true, right? On the other side, when you look at how much time you're creating content, and these are all from that survey, right? Some of you, 10%, said that more than 12 hours per week is spent on content. but well over the majority, over 70% of you said that you're spending more than 5 hours a week. That's a lot of time. And so how do we ensure that all of this time, all of this content actually gets adopted? And that's really what we ultimately want to solve as we think about the future. And in addition to that, the last survey stat that I'll share here, but I thought it was really interesting, is that 81% of respondents believe that not only do they not use their content, but the features in the platform as well. And we've frankly seen that in some cases, even with our platform and customers, and there's a lot of different variables that come into play in terms of, shifts in the business, et cetera, that might happen. But it's really, really important to take a step back at enablement, realize that, we've added all these features, all this functionality, and it's all exciting, right? All these features here, like presentation building and digital sales rooms, AI role playing, these happen to be the top 3 with the lowest adoption by teams. I'm excited about a few of these, and I'm happy to share my thoughts why, but I thought it was really interesting to see how low the adoption rate was. And what's interesting is I think when it really comes down to it is if your teams can't even use the content, if they can't find the content, how are they really going to, how can we expect them to want to use more of the platform? If they can't find the basic thing they need in that moment, how can we expect them to adopt all this additional value in these bells and whistles? And so that, this data paired with a lot of, really what I've been uncovering over the last 8 years of doing research and data and talking to all of you is really what shapes kind of my belief in the future. And I think Spekit, we're about what I'd say 30% of the way on the journey in terms of really where I think the future of enablement needs to go in terms of being super contextual, super personalized and simple. And so the first part of this presentation is really going to focus on the rep experience and kind of where I see things going. And then we'll focus really on what does that mean for the future of content? So first thing is I really fundamentally believe that the future of enablement has to be contextual. It has to be in the flow of work for your reps, right? And it's not just because I think that that's a really cool concept, right? I could go on and on around all the conveniences and the productivity time savings and, why it's going to help your reps spend more time selling, and I can pitch you on all that. But I actually think if we actually take a step back and, we're all human here, we all have a brain. If you actually look at the science of how we learn as humans, there's so much science that backs why learning information at a point in time that's relevant to you in a context that's relevant to you not only helps with content actually making it to your long-term memory, right? So making sure that you actually retain the information so that later when it comes up, you can repeat it. But it also ensures that you have less distractions, and so that you can apply it, immediately afterwards. And so your ability to apply that knowledge in the moment also has huge benefits on your ability to retain it. And so I go into a lot more depth in the book. I don't want to give the entire book away, but I spend time really diving into this because many of you weren't at SEC in New York, but that's the Sales Enablement Collective Conference in New York. There's about, I would guess, 200 to 250 folks in the room. I can't recall the exact amount. But when I asked, how many of you have actually spent time studying the science of how our brains work, right? How information makes it from our short-term memory to our long-term memory, how recall works, how encoding works. There was maybe 5 people in the room that raised their hands. And that's not to put anyone to shame by any means, right? I frankly hadn't really studied this until a few years ago when I really, really got into it. But I think it's essential for anyone that's going to be really responsible for training reps, for enabling them to really spend time understanding, how do we actually learn? And that was the question that I asked myself 8 years ago, which is okay, if we're going to try and solve this problem, how do we actually learn? How can we solve this problem in a way that is actually mirrored to how our bodies respond to things? And so I go into a lot more on this, but Gartner also shows that there's actual quantitative results from it, right? So Gartner did a big research report. It came out last year that, really evaluated organizations that are actually using just-in-time learning as part of their workflows. And they found that sellers are 2.5 times more likely to exceed their revenue targets if they're enabled just in time. Just in time meaning in their flow of work at the right time, right? They're also 3.5 times more likely to actually achieve their customer retention targets, because at the end of the day, your sales and your CS teams, while their needs might be slightly different based off their specific use cases, of course, we do have a lot of combined enablement. We also do role-specific enablement as well. At the end of the day, right, your customer experience, your buyer experience starts with your employee experience. And so if you're not enabling your employees correctly, you can't expect your customers to get the answers and the information that they need. And the same goes for your marketing team, who also needs to deeply understand your products and services so that they can ultimately create compelling content, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of stats that show that not only does it help with revenue generation, but it also helps with employee retention. So I encourage you, if you haven't really spent time doing the actual research on the validity behind just-in-time learning, enablement, and the importance of context and shaping how someone actually absorbs information, I highly encourage you to, because ultimately it is going to make a difference on how you think about enablement. And I think the more people that really spend time kind of reverse engineering, like what I've tried to do over the last 8 years, is how do we reverse engineer into like the ideal rep experience? I think it really can help you shape how you design your enablement programs, right? What's best suited for like a live training, right? Because by no means am I saying that live trainings go away. I think live trainings are really important, but what is the content in a live training? How do you present that information? What is the ultimate objective of that time? And I think it's very different than the way that many companies use live trainings, which is like, here's the process. Let me throw a bunch of things at you and share 25 slides while your reps are, on their email and on Zoom and on Slack distracted and hoping that people remember things. Next, I really believe that the future of enablement is personalized, right? Where it's actually tailored to each individual rep's needs. Because at the end of the day, you can have 2 reps that join on the exact same day. They go through the same, let's say, week of onboarding in terms of tool setup, et cetera, but they're going to encounter different situations at different times, right? And so, let's say you have 2 BDRs that join on the same day, right? Maybe week 1, they get on calls by day 5. One just might get lucky and the person, responds. And they get a call. They're going to need to know how to create that opportunity, how to make that successful handoff to the AE, and all those individual steps much sooner than that other BDR that might not get to that point for another few days. So how do you make sure that as they're going through their everboarding journey, as they're going through their learning journey, the information they need, whether it's process guidance, an answer, a piece of collateral, learning, meets them as they're going through it? And really the reason I believe this is so important is that, if you look at our own consumer experiences, right? Our phones, how we interact with social experiences, it's all personalized to how each individual likes to learn and based on our preferences. And so, or how you like to consume information. So ultimately, envision a world where your buyers are receiving personalized content that's actually based on their needs, where your everboarding experience is actually tailored to each rep, where your reps are receiving much more tailored, specific situational coaching as they're going through their day. And ultimately, where your change enablement, as you're doing all this change across your business, feels really simple and targeted at the right point in time. So we can spend a little bit more time on that, but ultimately, I really believe that artificial intelligence here is the breakthrough, right? We've been talking about creating personalized experiences for years, for decades, frankly, before I was thinking about this problem, admittedly. But this is the first time that I think, thanks to technology, this is truly possible. Right? In the past, yes, you could somewhat create personalized experiences, but that required you to go into, different systems and do all sorts of different field mappings between, Salesforce and whatever system it is, or create all these workflows and triggers. And it was really, really complicated. And I'm sure many of you guys listening have created those kinds of workflows. Now with artificial intelligence, it can consume and extract data at a rate and magnitude that was, frankly, just not possible before. And so it can take the context from a task. Let's say that your customer, sends you an email about your product. You're a rep, you just got off call, and your customer follows up and says, hey, I just had a quick question on, how this integration works. Well, artificial intelligence can be used not only to scan that question and understand, like, hey, what is the customer asking, but it can also then scan all your other data across your tech stack to understand, well, who is this customer? Are they a customer? Are they a prospect? Have we talked to them? Right? Oh, there's an active deal. What industry are they in? What product are they evaluating? How many other calls have we had with them? Oh, they asked this thing on this other call. Okay, great. And using all this context and an AI engine that can run through a number of different mechanisms, right? It can then really understand what is it that this employee, or in this case, customer, needs, and how can the employee, the rep, ultimately service them with the most important information. And without the rep even knowing that that information exists, an AI engine can ultimately recommend that content to them in that exact moment. And so admittedly, we're on the early steps of this journey. But even then, what we've been able to deliver is really remarkable. I see, Erin, you commented in the chat, but I think one of the examples that you designed actually was by far one of the most impressive I've seen, where, based off of a call, you can take the call transcript and recommend content automatically and automatically generate an email. I mean, that kind of productivity gains, but not just productivity gains, but making sure that your reps are actually sending what's relevant to your buyers is really going to make a big difference in a world where 86% of buyers have already made a decision by the time they speak to your rep. They're already doing their own, informed buying decisions. By the time they speak to their rep, if the rep is sending a case study and resources that are completely irrelevant to them, they're going to check out. And so lastly, I believe that the future has to be simple, right? We've overcomplicated things. I think somewhere along the way, there was a lot of different, frameworks and ideas. And, I think every single one of those had validity to them and it was well-intentioned. But I think at the end of the day, we've overcomplicated things. And I believe it's essential that from a rep standpoint, considering all of the change that they're already having to keep track of. And if you spend time and really, watch how your reps are working, the amount of steps they're taking just to ultimately deliver the best experience possible for your customers, we want to make their job as simple as possible. And so when you think about the actual user experience of whatever solution you're designing, whether it's a homegrown system, like a Google site, whether it's an enablement platform, whether it's a piece of content you're able to do, I really encourage you to spend some time researching the science of habit formation, or more so the psychology of habit formation. Charles Duhigg wrote a book on this topic called, Atomic Habits, sorry. And that book is just absolutely phenomenal in terms of how we as humans ultimately adopt or don't adopt new habits, right? And he uses a lot of different examples in terms of both how we go to the gym and not. I've read actually quite a few books on the subject, but I think it's really fascinating as we think about software and technology and how we actually create user experiences that reps will actually adopt in their day-to-day. So you don't just end up in another graveyard of tools, because we've all spent so much money on tools that ultimately don't get adopted. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. But ultimately, I believe that your reps aren't lazy. They're busy, right? And frankly, they expect a consumer grade experience, right? When you look at the technology that we use in our day-to-day, our phones, ChatGPT, you name it, right? Those are the expectations. That is how we operate in our day-to-day. And this next generation of employees, the ones that truly grew up on cell phones, back when even in my generation, I didn't grow up on a cell phone. That came to me later, as I was getting into high school. But I've seen some of my cousins and nieces and nephews, they got that introduced in elementary school, which is crazy to think about. I understand why. But at the end of the day, they are so accustomed to everything being so fast and so instant. We live in this world of instant gratification. So I think it's really important to think about, how does your enablement program, when you think about where your information lives, ultimately becomes a very simple experience for your reps. And so this is just an example of one of our customers recently that used our new module to be able to really quickly generate shareable links. So in their use case, they use us for content management. They were able to find 3 assets, generate the links, and have the email out within 2 minutes start to finish, right? In my old workflow, it would have taken 20 minutes in our former sales content management system. That is ultimately the kind of instant experience that we want for reps, because I want him spending way more time actually preparing for his meetings and spending time really thinking through what are the most important discovery questions I can ask, versus, hey, let's go and dig for information. And I think there's a big shift that's also happening right now in technology, that if you look at, the majority of rep technology up until now, whether it's, the gongs and outreaches and the CRMs of the world, right, really inspired by Salesforce, the majority of our experiences up until now have really been, primarily list views or spreadsheets and forms, right? Opportunity records, account records, they're all forms. Your views have all been reports where you can hide columns and filter. And that's kind of what we assumed was just the expected behavior of any software. I think now what's quite different is that you're seeing a lot more technologies really leaning into this idea of natural language processing. It's a technology, it's an AI, it's a type of technology that can power a user interface where your reps can actually ask questions in natural language. So instead of saying, hey, well, you guys all use ChatGPT, I don't need to give this example, but in this instance, instead of filtering down and going through a spreadsheet and looking for the product price, you can ask a question with a lot of different variables and get the exact answer. This isn't just, what's happening in the world of content. I can tell you right now, the world of content, every platform is going to look like this. instantly, but it's happening across the entire workflow. And so in a world where you've got all these different assistants that the rep is using, what does that look like? So I spent a lot of time thinking about, hey, what does the future of an enablement experience looks like where the rep is actually interacting with a lot of different potential assistants across their workflow. And while, there's a part of me that's just like, that's ridiculous. This is silly. We're never going to work that way. I think change is happening so fast across every technology that we're seeing, that we're using, that I actually think that that's in the matter of like the next couple of years, not the next decade. And so I'm really thinking about, how do we need to integrate with different technologies to ultimately create the most effective enablement assistant possible for your reps. Now, with this rise of artificial intelligence and these chat-like interfaces that are so exciting, we have a whole other problem to solve, and that is ultimately the accuracy of that information. This is the problem that keeps me up at night. If you've ever spoken to me, I can almost guarantee that content governance and decay came up. And I'd say we have not yet innovated on it in a way that I'm really, really proud of, but we've got really cool things that we're currently working on that I think are really going to transform, how we think about content governance. Because what we've thought up until now has been, hey, let's go and set expiration dates and let's work on approval processes and let's build all these manual workflows that create more work for us to try and stay on top of our information so that as content sits in your platform, eventually you can be reminded to review it and update it, etc. None of that has worked, right? Content decay is still a massive, massive problem. And while people ask about it, when you ask them back, like, hey, how has that worked in your current platform? The answer is unanimously, it just hasn't. It creates an illusion of working, but it doesn't. And so when I really try and break down the problem of like, okay, how do we really think about content decay and garbage in and out? Because right now, only 35% of sales professionals trust the accuracy of the data in their orgs. I think about it as garbage in, which is like, what is the information in the system itself, right? So the content, the enablement, the learning, the training, or in a CRM, it would be your data. And what is garbage out? What is the actual response that's being populated in the chat interface going to your buyers? And so those are two different problems. Now, if you look at most solutions out there, right? So you think about like a Microsoft Copilot, for example, if you look at solutions like Glean, a lot of their value proposition right now is really hinging on, hey, we're going to have like such a powerful algorithm within the interface that we're going to find the best answer possible. And, they're really focused on the garbage out problem. Basically, they're saying, hey, we're going to take all your content and we're going to focus on the garbage out problem and build the best algorithm to answer the best question. But I think, frankly, that's a backwards way of thinking about it. I think that is, yes, we have to do that. Of all the responses, which one's the best one? And we've got an entire team that's literally solely focused on that. But at the end of the day, like, what if the only answer is wrong? What if the only answer in the system is wrong? We have to think differently about that, right? Because what you don't want to say is, oh, we're just going to look through all your garbage and find the best piece of garbage. No, you want to figure out how do we make sure that content that we're feeding from is ultimately intact and stays up to date. And that's really the question that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, because content decay is the problem, I believe, of the next decade forward. Well, hopefully we'll solve it well before then, but if it goes unsolved, it's going to be one of the biggest problems for organizations, right? Not just in terms of like the kind of content that their buyers see, but also internal enablement. Like I was looking at our own team, like our own team relies on content, and it's not intentional, but the reality is our products and services are changing so fast that like I want to fix this because we need to solve this problem internally. And so when we did this survey, we found that right now 50% of teams believe that more than 40% of their content needs a refresh. That is a massive amount. That is a massive amount of teams. In fact, only 5% of teams believe that all their content is up to date. And I laughed in the room. I was like, does anyone fall in that bucket? And I don't know who these 5.6% of people are. If you're one of them, please reach out to me. I would love to hear and analyze what you're doing. But the reality is that like a lot of our content is out of date. And so the question is, how could we imagine a world where content stays fresh? And so that's a problem that I've been pondering for the last few years that I'm really excited that we're finally innovating on. Because at the end of the day, 51% of respondents said that content management and decay is a huge reason as to why, again, they go from one platform to the next, right? They buy in, they design it, and then after a while, it's like, oh, well, that became a black hole. It's all out of date. So let's go to this new platform and hope that things are different. The real question is like, what's going to be different? How is this platform going to be different? What is going to be unique about it that ultimately makes it easier for you to repurpose your content and keep your content up to date? And that's really the problem I'm trying to solve, because when you look at the current landscape, right, And if you've seen it present before, you've seen a version of this slide for sure, but you've got all these different platforms, right? Digital adoption platforms, knowledge management platforms, content management, learning management systems. All of these are different types of content platforms. And all of these have literally hundreds of different options in them that are all trying to solve for different types of content. Now, when I tried to reverse engineer, I'm like, okay, this is a lot. How could we kind of simplify, like, what do all these platforms have in common? They have a really powerful content engine, right? Every single one of these content platforms has a foundation of content, and they have a few key things around them, right? Both discovery mechanisms, so things like search and filters and the ability to find things, right? Powerful engagement capabilities, right? The ability to view and share and learn. You can typically track engagement in terms of analytics and insights on your content. And there's a multitude of curation features, right? The ability to create content, sync content, et cetera, right? So like, that's kind of what I consider like the core content engine of any platform. And then the market says, hey, there's also this kind of like what I consider distinct set of capabilities that today are unique to these different categories that are really beneficial. And so up until recently, I'd say knowledge management systems, one of their biggest benefits was their more advanced search and governance capabilities. I'd say most CMS platforms have caught up, right? Content management systems had the benefit of being able to also store files, right? Because knowledge management systems, most of them couldn't, at least not when I was looking for a solution. So you needed a CMS too. And the external sharing was something that was really interesting there. Learning management systems have their own benefits in terms of how you can sequence information. And so there's different, capabilities that have a lot of value, but then there's also a lot of bells and whistles, right? There's a lot of capabilities that are unique to each category that, are super, super specialized in nature and may or may not be getting used. And so when you look at these different systems, and then you actually pull away the layers and you look at like, well, what does their content engine look like? Most of them, and I think most of the problem that we have around content decay is that most content systems are designed around these really rigid structures, right? These structures where you've got this, high level folder structure where content can live in one folder and one subfolder, and it's really rigid. You can't easily make content accessible in different places, which makes the admin and permissioning really tough. But you're also dealing with these really, really long documents, right? One of the number one use cases that customers typically use us for is what's called a sales playbook. And so it's typically this Bible of content that your organization has on all the things that your reps need to do to ultimately be successful, right? And it covers everything from your, ideal customer profile to segments, to competitors, to buyer personas. And we've had customers, the longest one we've received was 180 pages. That was how they were expecting their reps to ultimately know how to do their jobs. And so you've got these really long documents and you've got these really rigid folder structures. And the challenge with these long documents is like when something changes, which today is happening daily, as we've seen, how are you actually communicating that change, right? Your best option today is maybe to add a comment to the document and tag your team. Or maybe it's to share an email to your team saying, hey, go check page 16 of this change. Or you're just not updating the document at all and you're just going straight into Slack or whatever it is. And so the way that we've thought about content has been a big challenge in the past. And all of this complexity has a real cost too, right? The survey showed that the top reasons why features aren't implemented in these enablement platforms is because enablement teams don't have enough time, right? So 38.7% of teams don't have enough time to implement the cool features they want to. And the other 25% were that they were harder to implement or they didn't work as expected, right? So there are some challenges with existing features. And I think you're going to see that more as a lot of companies are continuing to innovate and try and race to get things out. I hope that we are not one of those. But at the end of the day, there's also a lot of time that's being spent on adminning. We're not talking about content creation time. We're not talking about time that you're spending actually in, measuring insights and analyzing what's working and being strategic and being a good partner to your CRO. We're talking about time literally configuring the platform. About the large, not quite the majority said about 4 hours, but quite a few here said that they were spending anywhere between 5 and 12 hours just administrating the platform. That doesn't scale in a world where things are changing constantly. And so we're going to spend a couple minutes here talking about, well, what could the future of content look like that looks different than what we've been accustomed to? And I imagine a world that's unified, that's dynamic, and where content is measurable. And so what does it mean that it's unified? Well, one, I believe that we really, really need to focus on that core content engine. Right? In a world where things are changing constantly, your ability to have a really powerful way to keep content ultimately fresh and up to speed is super critical. And so the question is, how could you create a platform that, or an enablement experience that combines the different aspects or the different jobs to be done by these different platforms into kind of a single solution? But more importantly, how could we rethink content, right? And for me, my inspiration really, as in terms of how I think about content, really comes from Spotify, but I love Apple Music as well. But if you think about music playlists, and if you've created a music playlist before, if you've used Spotify's interface, I'm sure Apple's is the same, but you can go through and really easily take a song that you love and put it in different playlists. And not just that, you can put it in different orders in different playlists. And so I've got my getting ready in the morning playlist where it's a little bit more chill and it gradually goes up in speed as I get on with my day. I've got my going out playlist, which has me, kind of transitioning from work mode to, let's say, going out to dinner, where it's a little bit more fun and trying to get me out of the stress of the day. I can have the same song in those two playlists, but it might be at the very end of one and at the beginning of the other. I've taken the same model to really rethink, how could this apply to how we think about content? Right? How could we break up these long documents where there's certainly value in having all the information in a specific order, but actually making it more reusable across different use cases? How could you onboard your teams with the same battle cards that they're then going to be using as part of their day-to-day? So you're not creating a separate, course or whatever you want to call it on your competitor and a separate battle card. Instead, you're using different user experiences, right? Different flexible user experiences where when you're in learning mode, you're consuming the same information potentially in a different format than if you're just on the go and asking a question. So it's not about, hey, let's have content duplicated across all these different systems, right? And have a PowerPoint for it and have a document for it and have a course for it. Instead, how can we use technology to create a flexible user experience so that your content can live in different places in different orders? And so that's really where I think the future of content's going in the model that we're really focused on. But then the other piece is, okay, if we think about, all that time spending in admin, and this is something I spent a lot of time talking to teams about, the large majority of admin time is spent on things like tagging content, right? Let's tag it by industry. Let's tag it by, part of the sales process that we want it to be used, and let's tag it by persona. Well, the good news for you is that artificial intelligence can do a way better job than you can at that, and take that job away. In fact, what you'll see, we've been testing this now for over a year. Actually, I was looking just last night at when we released our recommendation engine, the first version. But even then, you didn't need to tag anything, because basically an AI engine can read your content and automatically interpret what industry are we talking about, who would be the best suited for it. And if you have it learning on your other content, it can become really, really smart. And the power of technology, or the technology that's ultimately powering that kind of experience, are kind of the evolutions of technology when it comes to content management. So knowledge graphs is one approach that really allows you to create basically relationships between your content. So let's take that Spotify example here. A knowledge graph in the world of Spotify is, hey, you've got your song, right? And that song was created by an artist. So let's say, I really should have come prepared. Let's say Who Let the Dogs Out. I don't know why that song came to my mind, but Who Let the Dogs Out, that I believe is by Baha Men. So you've got the song Who Let the Dogs Out. You've got the artist, right, that's related. But then you've also got potentially the album that's related, right? But then you've also got the record label. And so you've got all these relations. And so if you look at Baha Men, you might also get recommended, hey, you might want to look at, this song, or you might want to look at, this other artist. So that's how these knowledge graphs allow you to ultimately find related information in a much more scalable way. And then similarly, you've got vector databases that basically allow you to semantically understand your content and your information, where you don't even need to tell it. It's able to extract similarities. And that's really where you look at features like Spotify Radio or Pandora Radio back in the day. That's really the kind of technology that's powering those experiences, which is, hey, here's a type of genre, or here's a type of feeling to a music that feels similar to this kind of feeling or this type of music, right? This feels like a summer genre. And so those technologies that have been so prevalent in, the recommendations powering Netflix and Spotify and all these experiences that we use in our day-to-day, I believe it's time to bring to content. And that's really where the future of content's going, where artificial intelligence is going to be able to really ensure that your teams, if they ask a product question, recommending to them, hey, you might also want to look at this product because customers who buy this product also look at this product, right? Or, hey, you might want to look at this feature because it was just released related to this product, et cetera, without you having to go in and tinker every single step of it. So with that, The question is, well, how do we make sure that we solve the garbage in problem? How do we make sure that your content stays up to date? And that's why I believe the future of content is dynamic. I think today when we think about content in the workplace, you've got your data over here, and then you've got content over here. And the two are completely disconnected. Now, if you followed along our journey, my experience at my last company was really in BizOps. And so I was responsible for basically taking over what was a failed Salesforce implementation. We had had no adoption, and we had every challenge under the sun you can imagine. That's what led me to actually founding Spekit. But in that challenge, one of the challenges that we had was that my team would be making changes to Salesforce, and then our documentation on Salesforce was out of date. And I was like, this is crazy that there's no way to connect these two. What if instead of someone over here creating content from scratch, we could instead have your Salesforce, which is changing, right? Let's say you add a new competitor to the pick list value. Let's say you add a new product to your product value. You could actually sync that and build your information, your knowledge around the data in your platform. And so that was really the kind of like thesis I had around like, what if your knowledge was actually connected to your data and to your data models? But I think the future becomes much more interesting where it's not just, hey, let's build one-to-one, but instead your battle card, right? And I think there's companies that are already doing this in a pretty fascinating way. I think Clue's one of them. But I think the future of all content is going to look like, hey, instead of having a battle card that your team is going in and manually, writing, and, bless all the marketers out there that are, tirelessly following all this competitive insights and things that are changing. What if instead it could listen to all the calls happening in Gong or Chorus or whatever tool of choice you use for conversation intelligence? Or what if it could pull from your CRM win-loss data and automatically track for insights, listen for insights and say, hey, your battle card says that this price is $10, but on these calls, the last 20 calls about this use case have heard a price of $50, let's say, from your competitors. Are you sure that's correct, right? And then actually suggest the change for you. And so we're experimenting a lot with this. We're actually about to launch a free tool on the justintimeenablement.com website that you'll be able to check out. But the whole idea is, how can we ultimately help you leverage the data to help dynamically inform and create your content? Because I think ultimately when it comes to solving the garbage in problem, it's really going to come down to how do we know something is out of date? Well, something might be out of date because either new information was added to the system, which makes it that now the existing content is no longer valid, or no information was added to the system, but there's a change that was detected outside of the system, right? And so to me, those are two different problems to solve, but they're two sides of the same coin, right? When it comes to your governance. And so if you read the book, this is actually the book that the part of the book that I've gotten the most feedback on, because I think every single enabler is trying to figure out, how do we ultimately ensure that our content stays up to date? And this chapter is actually on the most interesting for marketers too, which I found really fascinating. It's been really exciting to see, these different roles really come together and think about, how do we ensure that content stays up to date? And here I have this use case too, because I talk about change management in this chapter. I didn't present the slide at the Sales Enablement Collective, but I've gotten so much feedback on the change enablement, change management section of the book where, I really paint this vision. I think one of the big challenges that companies have is that they are, making all these changes over here. They're documenting these changes in one place. Then they're communicating it in Slack or Teams or Outlook and sending an email, and they're putting it in 5 or 6 different channels just to make sure that someone ultimately, read it, and it's chaotic. And so I really picture a world where your content, your knowledge, and your communications are deeply integrated, where you can curate your information, communicate and reinforce it, and then measure it all in a single workflow. And that's actually one of the first things we built 8 years ago, really focused on the Salesforce process adoption, but we've scaled that across different use cases because I think that ultimately change management, change enablement is the one thing that every company outside of content decay, which the two of them go hand in hand, just isn't that good at. And so, and again, this applies to everyone. I'll even put, I actually think we're pretty good at the change enablement piece. But anyway, I will say that if you're interested in change management, I'd love to hear from you, because I think that this is really a problem that's worth spending time thinking about. And this is actually change management, change enablement is the #1 topic I speak to CROs about. That is when their ears go up and they're like, we need to figure out how to manage change more effectively and reinforce that and feel confident that folks are absorbing it. And so lastly, I alluded to it, but measuring, right? This is a sticking point. I was a little bit nervous about writing some of this in the book, because I was like, man, I really hope that I don't frustrate anyone in writing it. But at the end of the day, like, I think ROI up until now has been a little bit of a fallacy when it comes to most platforms, right? And the survey showed that 41.9% of enablers rate their platform a 2 out of 5 when it comes to proving ROI. Why? Because it's really tough to prove that, hey, this training that was done on day 1 had an impact on this rep's activity on day 60, right? The time between when something happened and when the action took place, and being able to correlate those two is a little bit of a ruse. Just like being able to say, like, hey, because our buyer spent, 5 seconds opening the piece of content our rep sent, it influenced close one revenue, right? I think it's helpful if you extract that at the pattern level and you can see, hey, in our case, we're seeing how many of our we've launched all new case studies recently, and so we're seeing how are people responding to that. So there's certainly insights that you can get from understanding how people consume information in your buyers. But I think that there's been a layer of abstraction of what's really true here in terms of ROI versus like what are we hoping for. And so I really want to take a step back and really think about the concept of just-in-time enablement, because that's why I'm such a big believer in it. Because I think that ultimately, yes, we want to focus on the rep experience and we want it to be as easy as possible for them to get the information they need and frictionless, and make it and take all the thinking out of it having to be personalized so that they can focus on what they do best, right? And at the same time, it's really important that we understand what is actually working, what matters. And when you think about data, right? When you think about the power of AI, it's informed by data. You want to have the most insights possible on what your reps are actually doing. And when I asked most enablement teams and marketing teams, like, hey, what resources are your reps actually interacting with when they're preparing for a meeting? None of them can answer that question. No one actually knows what their reps are actually doing. The best you can see is like, well, we see that this content gets viewed the most, right? How do we actually understand like what information are your reps reviewing before a meeting? Wouldn't you want to know that, hey, this battle card was suggested to you because there's been a change that was in that battle card that you haven't seen yet as a rep? And rather than looking at that battle card before that next competitive deal, you ignored it. Wouldn't you want to know that? Or on the flip side, hey, this content keeps getting recommended because we're identifying themes and your content sucks on this topic. You might want to update this content because it's clearly coming up in all these contextual situations and there's a gap here. Or, hey, we're seeing that reps that actually review this type of information right before they go into this kind of call see a much higher progression of their stage rate. So I think that the whole concept of like measuring and engagement, like, yes, let's give you visibility into are people searching and viewing things and what are people asking, but let's actually understand like how can we correlate like, hey, this user, this was recommended to them in that very moment where it was relevant. They looked at it, they took action on it, and here's the next thing they did. And so the lapse of time between consuming information and applying it is reduced. And I think that's where you can really start correlating, cause and effect. So anyway, I speak a lot about this in the book because I think that like the future of enablement has to be more data-driven than it's been. I think the role of enablement, which I'm not going to cover today because I do want to give you an opportunity to actually go read the book. I go into a lot more depth on all these topics, but I think the role of enablement needs to shift, needs to evolve to really remain relevant. And I think that this is the most exciting time there's ever been in the role of enablement to really rethink, how can I be the most effective in my role? How can I use data? And how can I really get familiar with what data is accessible to me that I can then use to inform my strategy? So I'll go into a lot more in depth here, but I know we're getting up on time. I'm actually impressed that I was able to finish this. So, just to conclude, I won't go through everything in the book. I appreciate everyone that stayed on. I see some really great engagement there, so I appreciate it. Appreciate Chris Wolf, Sean, a few of you that had a chance to actually read an early version of the book and give feedback. But really, the reason I want more of us to be talking about these things is because I think that we can rise all tides, right? I think that every enablement platform, the leaders that, we all speak with each other. I think everyone's running towards these same problems. And I think that's a really, really positive thing for the future of enablement, right? Because I imagine a world where change management feels more simplified, where prospects receive really personalized, relevant information, where your onboarding is truly tailored and where coaching and feedback is personalized. And I'll be the first to admit, we're still not, this is still a vision, but I think it's a reality that's happening really, really quickly by the day. So if you haven't heard of Spekit, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear any questions you have, any feedback. Visit our website, spekit.com. We launched new branding, so we might look a little bit different if you haven't seen it yet. But thank you so much for hanging on today, and I look forward to your feedback. Again, if you haven't had a chance yet, you can get the book at justintimeenablement.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you'd like to. Awesome. Thank you so much.